In the year 1781, a British vessel set sail from the coast of Africa, carrying with it a human cargo far beyond what the ship was ever meant to hold. Imagine a ship built for trade, suddenly transformed into a place of suffocating confinement, its decks and dark holds filled with hundreds of men, women, and children. The air was heavy, the space impossibly tight, and every breath came with the weight of desperation. This was not just a voyage across the ocean, it was the beginning of a story of suffering, survival, and choices that would echo through history. The ship's departure marked the start of a journey that would reveal the very worst of human greed. Packed into overcrowded spaces, people were chained in rows, left with little room to move or even stretch. Their daily lives became a constant struggle against hunger, thirst, and the spread of sickness. The cries of children mixed with the groans of the weak, while the stench of illness lingered in the stagnant air. With every passing day, the conditions grew worse, as food and fresh water dwindled. The sea, vast and endless, offered no escape. For those trapped on board, there was no horizon of hope, only the relentless uncertainty of what lay ahead. Each sunrise was not a promise of survival but a reminder of the cruel gamble their lives had become. The crew, overwhelmed and unprepared for the sheer number of lives under their control, faced a crisis that would eventually drive them to decisions that defy comprehension. This is where the story takes its haunting turn. What happened aboard that vessel is not simply a tale from the past, it is a reflection of the darkest corners of human history. The events that unfolded would spark outrage, ignite debates about morality and justice, and eventually fuel movements that changed the world. As we journey deeper into this story, we will uncover not only the tragic fate of those on board, but also how their suffering forced nations to confront questions about humanity itself. This is not just history, it is a reminder of how far we have come, and how important it is to remember. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, take a moment to support this channel. Hit the like button so more people can learn about these untold histories, subscribe to stay connected with powerful stories from the past, and share this video with others who care about understanding the truth. Together, we can keep these voices alive, ensuring that their story echoes not only across the waves of history, but into our present and future. Below the creaking wooden decks, where the light of the sun could barely slip through cracks in the planks, hundreds of people were forced into a space never meant for human life. The air grew heavy the moment one descended into that dark, suffocating hold. With every breath, the stench of salt, sweat, and sickness clung to the lungs, leaving no relief. The narrow passageways were filled not with silence, but with an unbroken hum of suffering, groans, whispered prayers, and the restless shifting of chains. Each person carried their own story, their own memories of home and family, but here those identities were stripped away. They were reduced to bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit comfortably, unable to lie down without touching the next. The smallest children clung to their mothers, their cries muffled against skin as dry as parchment from thirst. For many, even the simple act of raising one's head required immense strength, for their limbs were bound and their spirits weakened. Hunger gnawed slowly but relentlessly. Meals came sporadically, meager rations that barely kept anyone alive. The food, when it arrived, was coarse and tasteless, and never enough to quiet the emptiness inside. Thirst was even more brutal. Fresh water was scarce, guarded and measured out as though every drop was worth its weight in gold. Mouths cracked from dryness, lips split, and tongues felt like sand. The longing for water was constant, and yet the ocean that stretched endlessly around them offered nothing but more torment, a cruel reminder that they were surrounded by abundance they could not drink. The air below deck was thick with heat, stale and unmoving. With no windows and little ventilation, breathing felt like inhaling fire. Sickness spread like a shadow, sweeping through the hold with silent efficiency. One person's cough became another's fever. Skin grew clammy, eyes dimmed, and yet there was no place to rest, no corner of comfort to escape to. Those too weak to rise often collapsed where they sat, their bodies left pressed against others who had no choice but to endure. But perhaps the heaviest burden was not just physical, it was the weight of fear and uncertainty. The people on board did not know where they were being taken or what awaited them. Some whispered of faraway lands where they might be forced to labor until death. Others held on to the faintest hope that this nightmare was temporary, that somehow they might see freedom again. But the days stretched endlessly, each one blending into the next, marked only by the sound of waves crashing against the hull and the footsteps of those who guarded them. Above deck, the world moved on, the sun rose, the sea rolled, and storms passed, but below, time seemed to stand still. The darkness blurred days into nights. Every so often, faint light would filter down when hatches opened, casting fleeting glimpses of faces worn by exhaustion. Eyes that once held fire now reflected despair. And yet, within those same eyes, sparks of resistance still flickered. Quiet determination pulsed through them, even in the bleakest hours. The journey was not simply across an ocean, it was across the boundaries of human endurance. Every passing day tested the limits of body and spirit. The people in that hold endured because they had no other choice, clinging to life when every circumstance around them conspired to take it away. It is in remembering these conditions, these moments of unimaginable endurance, that the true weight of this story comes to life. This was more than just a voyage. It was a trial by fire, a descent into the darkest corners of human history. And yet, even in that darkness, the strength to survive remained, a strength that echoes through time, reminding us of the resilience of the human spirit, even when stripped of freedom, comfort, and dignity. The sea can be both a pathway and a prison. For the crew of the vessel, the ocean was supposed to be familiar territory, a map they believed they could read by the stars, the winds, and the currents. Yet even the most seasoned sailors can falter, and on this voyage, a series of errors would turn a dangerous journey into a catastrophe. What should have been a relatively direct crossing became a meandering path across vast, unyielding waters. Each wrong turn, each miscalculation of distance, stretched the voyage further than anyone had prepared for. At first, the mistakes seemed minor. A shift in the winds here, a misjudged current there. The crew adjusted their sails and pressed onward, confident they could correct their course. But the ocean does not forgive hesitation. With every small error, the ship was carried farther from its intended route. Time dragged on, and the promised sight of land never appeared. Days became weeks, weeks blurred into something longer, and hope began to thin like the dwindling supplies below deck. The water barrels grew lighter with every dip of the ladle. Once plentiful, fresh water became something to measure carefully, poured sparingly into wooden cups that never filled enough. The food, too, began to vanish. What had been brought aboard was calculated for a journey of a certain length, not for one stretched by poor navigation and delays. Meals that once seemed meager became smaller still, and then smaller again, until the crew faced the same gnawing hunger that had long haunted those confined beneath the deck. For the sailors, the sea itself became a constant reminder of their mistakes. The horizon mocked them with its emptiness, a line that never broke with the outline of land. They watched the sun rise and fall, each cycle a marker of time lost, each evening a reminder of how far they still had to go. Maps were studied again and again, but the stars offered no comfort, only proof of how far they had strayed. The longer the voyage dragged on, the heavier the tension grew. Whispers of doubt spread among the men responsible for guiding the ship. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the sails, carried the weight of their uncertainty. The decisions of a few had placed the lives of hundreds in peril, yet there was no turning back, no safe harbor to retreat to. The only choice was forward, though forward seemed endless. Below deck, those who endured confinement suffered the consequences of each navigational mistake most of all. They did not know the details of the errors, nor the misread stars or misjudged winds. They only felt the effects. Each day brought less food, less water, and less strength. The ocean that surrounded them stretched on without mercy, and though they could not see the vast expanse of blue, they felt its power pressing in from every side. The crew's miscalculations turned survival into a delicate balance, one that tilted dangerously with every passing day. As barrels ran dry and the store of provisions dwindled to almost nothing, the voyage ceased to be just a journey, it became a test of endurance for every soul on board. Choices grew sharper, more desperate. The sailors knew they had lost their way, and with that loss came the realization that what lay ahead was no longer just a destination, but the shadow of consequences no one dared to fully name. The sea, vast and indifferent, carried the ship onward, yet offered no sign of reprieve. Navigation, once a tool of confidence and control, had failed them, and in that failure the ship was transformed into a floating trap. Each mistake stretched not only the journey, but also the suffering, creating a silence heavy with dread as the crew faced the truth they could no longer ignore. Their errors had condemned them all to a struggle that few could hope to survive. Night on the open ocean is unlike anything on land. The waves are dark shadows, rising and falling with a rhythm that feels eternal. The stars hang above in their countless numbers, watching silently as the world below shifts with every swell of the sea. On one such night, the crew of the vessel gathered with a decision that would forever stain the pages of history. Supplies had run dangerously low, and desperation, sharpened by fear and greed, drove them to a choice that defied all humanity. Whispers passed among the officers first, quiet words spoken in corners, carried in low voices so that not all could hear. They spoke not of survival for all, but of calculation, how the ship might be saved, how profit might be secured, how loss might be transformed into something else. It was not the kind of discussion where compassion had a place. It was a meeting of numbers, of cold reasoning, of lives weighed against ledger books. The conclusion they reached was one that twisted the logic of necessity into an act of unspeakable cruelty. They told themselves the ship could not continue with so many mouths to feed, that the dwindling supplies would not last. And so they framed their choice not as destruction, but as preservation, preservation of the vessel, preservation of wealth, preservation of their own survival. But what that meant in practice was a horror that the ocean would be forced to bear. One by one, people were taken from the darkness of the lower deck and brought into the night air above. The wind carried the salt of the sea, cool against skin, but it was no freedom. The stars gave no comfort. The waves below churned endlessly, waiting. For those brought above, there was no explanation, no mercy, only the hands of others steering them toward the ship's edge. Imagine the confusion, the terror, the cries that filled the night. Some struggled, desperate to cling to the planks beneath their feet, while others froze in disbelief, unable to understand until the moment the sea swallowed them whole. The sound of the water closing over each body echoed again and again, a rhythm of despair that marked the passing of more than 100 souls. The ocean, vast and indifferent, became a graveyard without markers, its depths holding the weight of lives erased by greed. The crew acted with chilling efficiency, as though each act was not the destruction of a human life but the execution of a task. The tally grew larger, the numbers mounting until over 130 lives had been taken by the waves. And still the ship pressed onward, lighter in supplies, lighter in human presence, but heavier with the burden of what had been done. For those who remained, the horror was inescapable. The memory of voices silenced, of faces vanishing into the darkness, lingered long after the sea had closed over them. Fear hung heavy in the air, for everyone knew that survival was not guaranteed, that decisions could be made again, and again, with the same cold logic. The ocean remembers. It carries the echoes of those nights, the cries that were swallowed by the waves, the lives that never saw another dawn. And though the ship continued on its path, though the crew may have convinced themselves that their actions were necessary, history would not forget. The tragedy became more than a single moment of cruelty, it became a symbol of what happens when human life is treated as expendable, when greed overpowers morality, when survival is twisted into justification for the unforgivable. This part of the story is not only a recounting of numbers or actions, but a reminder of the depths to which people can sink when blinded by profit and fear. It forces us to confront the darkest truths of the past and to carry forward the memory of those whose lives were taken beneath the stars, into the endless, unmarked waters of the sea. When the ship finally reached its destination, the ocean still held the silence of more than 100 souls swallowed by the waves. But for the men who commanded the voyage, that silence was not grief, it was calculation. The tragedy was not spoken of in terms of lives lost, but in terms of property, of numbers, of what could be recovered in coin. And so began one of the most chilling chapters in the history of the sea, the transformation of a mass killing into a financial dispute. In the world of trade and empire, merchants understood the language of profit more fluently than any other. Ships carried sugar, tobacco, rum, spices, and human lives, all of it measured in value on a ledger. And so, when the Zong's owners looked back on what had happened, they did not see horror. They saw what they called a loss at sea. In their minds, the storm, the sickness, and the scarcity of water were not failures of planning or navigational errors, they were conditions that justified their actions. And the actions themselves, they claimed, were not crimes but measures of necessity. So they drafted their claim. They approached the insurers with an argument that still chills the imagination, that the people cast into the ocean were not victims but cargo, and that the drowning of more than 100 individuals should be compensated just as if barrels of goods had been spoiled in transit. They framed it as a simple matter of maritime law, stripping away every trace of humanity until all that remained was a financial calculation. In the courtrooms of London, far from the cries that once pierced the night at sea, this case was heard not as a tragedy but as a business dispute. Lawyers stood before judges, not to demand justice for the dead, but to argue whether or not an insurance policy should pay out. The question was never framed as, was it right, but rather, was it lawful? And under the laws of that time, people stolen from their homes and chained aboard ships were not recognized as sons, daughters, or parents. They were counted as property. This was the cruel paradox of the age, a courtroom in one of the world's most powerful nations debating whether human lives lost could be tallied in coins. Witnesses described the voyage, the shortage of water, the fear that the rest would not survive. The owners claimed they acted in the interest of saving the ship, and therefore the insurance company owed them compensation. It was as if the waves themselves had washed away not only the bodies but also the very recognition of their humanity. Imagine the coldness of those hearings. No mourning, no acknowledgement of dignity, only numbers. One side argued for reimbursement. The other resisted the claim, not out of moral outrage, but because they disputed the circumstances under which the loss occurred. The lives of more than 100 people were reduced to lines in an account book, their deaths debated like spoiled cargo. And the verdict? The court did not call it murder. It did not even call it a tragedy. Instead, it accepted the idea that this was a matter of property, a dispute between merchants. In that moment, the law revealed its harsh truth: it was not written to protect the lives of the enslaved but to safeguard the profits of those who trafficked them. Yet, even in such darkness, cracks began to form. News of the case spread. The very fact that it had been argued so openly horrified many who heard it. Activists seized upon the story, retelling it in pamphlets and speeches, forcing the public to confront the brutal reality of the trade that so many had tried to ignore. The Zong case became a rallying cry, a symbol of the dehumanization at the heart of the system. What the ship's owners thought was a routine financial matter became one of the sparks that helped ignite the abolitionist movement in Britain. But think about the perspective for a moment. For the men in that courtroom, the voices of those who perished were absent. The victims had no chance to speak, no representation, no recognition of their humanity. Their story was told only through the lens of those who had destroyed them. And yet, across history, their silence has spoken louder than any words uttered in those legal proceedings. The insurance claim of the Zong was not just an attempt to reclaim money. It was the clearest example of a world where profit was placed above humanity, where the law itself was complicit in erasing the value of life. To understand this chapter is to confront the reality that cruelty was not only tolerated but legalized, normalized, and defended in courts of power. Today, the Zong case endures not because of the financial arguments, but because of what it reveals about the age that allowed it. It tells us that behind every coin earned in that trade, there was a cost that cannot be measured in numbers. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by the grand victories and defeats of nations but also by the cries that went unheard, the lives erased in silence, and the chilling fact that, for a time, even the taking of more than 100 souls could be disguised as nothing more than lost cargo. In the winter of 1783, inside the polished wooden chambers of an English courtroom, a story of the sea reached the ears of men in powdered wigs and long black robes. It was a story that should have been told with grief, trembling voices, and the weight of loss. Instead, it arrived dressed in the language of commerce, contracts, and claims. What had happened on that distant voyage was not brought forward as a question of justice for the dead, but as a dispute over money, an insurance claim filed by shipowners who saw the drowning of more than 100 captives as nothing more than the loss of property. The courtroom itself was a place of ritual and order. Candles flickered against oak-paneled walls, law clerks shuffled stacks of parchment, and the air carried the solemn gravity of legal proceedings. Yet within this setting, the tragedy of the zone was transformed. Where one might have expected the words murder or atrocity, the argument circled instead around maritime law, precedent, and financial responsibility. The judges were asked not whether a crime had been committed, but whether an insurance company should pay compensation for what the shipowners described as a necessary sacrifice. The year was a turbulent one. Britain was still reeling from the loss of its American colonies, its empire recalibrating, its merchants fiercely protective of their profits. And in this atmosphere, the Zone case landed on the docket like a storm-tossed vessel. The facts were known, the voyage had gone awry, water had grown scarce, and more than 100 captives had been thrown overboard. But in court, those facts were stripped of human pain. They were reshaped into legal questions, carefully phrased so as to avoid the recognition of humanity in those who had perished. The shipowners' lawyers stood before the bench with measured tones, presenting their argument as though it were a matter of logic and necessity. The captives, they said, had been lost in order to save the ship and the rest of its cargo. Therefore, the insurers were obliged to honor the claim. It was an argument that reduced the screams of the drowning to ledger entries and balanced accounts. The insurers, for their part, resisted, not out of moral outrage, but because they doubted the circumstances. Did the crew truly face a crisis of survival, or had they acted recklessly? Was the shortage of water genuine, or had navigational errors and mismanagement created the crisis? The courtroom echoed not with mourning but with technicalities, who bore responsibility, and who should bear the financial loss. The judges listened. They nodded, questioned, weighed the arguments. For them, the matter was framed in the cold clarity of the law. The dead did not appear as individuals in the record. They appeared only as a contested category, a disputed claim in a commercial contract. The court did not ask whether the killings were right or wrong. It asked only whether they were insurable. Outside the walls of that courtroom, however, news of the case began to spread. Pamphlets carried whispers of the proceedings, recounting the grotesque reality hidden behind the legal language. Activists seized upon the story, horrified by the notion that lives could be dismissed as cargo in a court of law. For them, this was more than a commercial dispute, it was evidence of the brutal machinery that underpinned the trade, laid bare for all to see. But inside the courtroom, the voices of those who perished were absent. No witness could rise to speak on their behalf, no advocate could argue for their dignity. Their story was told only through the mouths of the men who had condemned them. The proceedings were clinical, precise, and detached, as though the ocean itself had washed away not only the bodies but the very idea of their humanity. The decision, when it came, reflected the world as it was then. The court treated the matter as property law, affirming that the insurance claim could stand. It was a moment that revealed how deeply profit and commerce outweighed life in the hierarchy of empire. Yet paradoxically, it was also the very nature of this decision, the coldness with which it was made, that gave fuel to the growing abolitionist movement. For those who heard of it, the Zone case was impossible to forget. It crystallized the cruelty of the system in a single image, a courtroom in England debating not whether lives had value, but whether their destruction was reimbursable. It shocked the conscience of many who had remained silent, forcing them to confront what the trade truly meant. And so, what began as a routine insurance claim became something far greater. It became a symbol, a rallying point, a stain that no legal technicality could erase. The year 1783 did not deliver justice for those lost to the sea, but it planted a question in the minds of many: how long could a society call itself civilized while treating human lives as numbers on a balance sheet? The echoes of that courtroom still resound today. Not in the language of contracts and ledgers, but in the enduring reminder that silence in the face of injustice can turn tragedy into routine. The Zong case was framed as a commercial dispute, but history remembers it differently. History remembers the silence of the court, the absence of justice, and the chilling lesson that even the most horrifying of acts can be disguised when profit sits at the center of the world. When the details of the Zong tragedy emerged, they spread slowly at first, carried on whispered conversations and brief notes in pamphlets. But soon, the full weight of the revelation could not be contained. In drawing rooms, coffeehouses, and pulpits, people began to murmur about a ship on which over 100 lives had been deliberately cast into the sea, not as punishment, not even as the chaos of mutiny, but as a calculated act in the name of profit. For some, it was only another grim story of the trade. But for others, it was the breaking point, the proof they had been seeking that the system was as cruel as it was indefensible. Among those who refused to let the matter slip into silence were two men whose lives could not have been more different, yet whose convictions aligned: Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp. Together, they transformed the Zong case from a quiet legal dispute into a rallying cry for the abolitionist movement. Equiano, who had himself been taken across the ocean in bondage as a child, understood the full depth of the horror better than most. By the time the Zong case came to light, he had already gained his freedom and become a powerful voice, telling his story to all who would listen. For him, the revelations were not abstract. They were personal. The faces of the lost were not nameless or distant. They were reflections of his own past, reminders of how easily his fate could have been theirs. He carried the story with him into public halls and private gatherings, retelling it with the gravity of someone who spoke not from hearsay, but from lived experience. Granville Sharp, a man of law and letters, had long been appalled by the trade. A tireless campaigner, he had already challenged cases in court, arguing for the rights of those taken against their will. Where others saw legal technicalities, Sharp saw moral battles. When the Zong case reached his ears, he recognized immediately its potential to shock the public conscience. He understood that here was an atrocity so stark, so blatant, that it could cut through the apathy of those who had turned away from subtler arguments. Together, Equiano and Sharp made sure the Zong was not forgotten. Equiano carried the details to those with power and influence, determined to expose the cruelty hidden behind the language of commerce. Sharp pursued the matter with unrelenting legal pressure, demanding that the courts revisit what had been disguised as nothing more than an insurance dispute. Where the shipowners had sought to cloak their actions in contracts, Sharp stripped the veil away, naming the act for what it was: mass killing. The story began to spread wider. Writers published scathing critiques, pamphleteers circulated accounts of the case, and speakers invoked the Zong tragedy in gatherings across England. The image of human beings deliberately cast into the waves struck a chord too deep to ignore. It became more than just another story of the trade, it became the symbol of everything the abolitionists had been fighting to expose. Outrage grew. In churches, ministers thundered from their pulpits about the sin of such an act. In homes, families discussed it around their tables with unease. In Parliament, some began to murmur that perhaps the abolitionists had a point, that a trade that allowed such horrors could not be justified, no matter the wealth it brought. But it was not simply the act itself that stirred outrage. It was the coldness with which it had been defended. The idea that lives could be equated to cargo, that insurance payments could be claimed for the deliberate destruction of human beings, shocked even those who had long turned a blind eye. It laid bare the system for what it truly was, not commerce, but a machinery of suffering dressed in the language of law. Equiano and Sharp pressed on relentlessly. They understood that movements are built not only on reason but on stories, stories that pierce the heart and awaken the conscience. The Zong gave them such a story. It was not one they wished to tell, but one they knew had to be told, again and again, until indifference gave way to action. And indeed, it did. Though the Zong case did not bring justice to those who had perished, it sparked a fire that spread across the abolitionist cause. The outrage it provoked helped gather momentum for a movement that would, in time, challenge the very foundations of the trade. The names of the shipowners faded into obscurity, but the names of those who spoke out, Equiano, Sharp, and others who joined them, endured. The legacy of their efforts was not immediate victory, but the steady turning of the tide. Each pamphlet, each speech, each retelling of the Zong's dark voyage chipped away at the walls of complacency. And in that long struggle, the tragedy of the Zong was transformed. It was no longer only a story of loss at sea. It became a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry, a reminder that silence in the face of cruelty is itself a form of complicity. The ocean had carried away more than 100 lives, but their memory, lifted by the voices of abolitionists, refused to sink. Equiano and Sharp made sure of that. They carried the story ashore, and in doing so, they ensured that the world would be forced to reckon with it. At first, the judgment seemed to confirm everything the shipowners had hoped for. In the solemn quiet of the English courtroom, their arguments found favor with the judges. The deaths at sea, they declared, could indeed be considered a loss of cargo, a matter covered by maritime insurance. For the shipowners, it was a moment of vindication, a legal recognition that their decision had been justified, that profit could outweigh lives when framed within the language of commerce. But outside the courtroom, the ruling landed like a thunderclap. To many who heard of it, the verdict was not merely troubling, it was chilling. Could the law of England, a nation that prided itself on justice and order, truly reduce human beings to insurable property? Could a court of law accept the deliberate destruction of lives as no more consequential than the loss of timber or sugar in a storm? The unease grew louder with every retelling. Abolitionists seized upon the ruling, repeating it in pamphlets, sermons, and speeches, forcing people to confront the implications. It was not only the act aboard the ship that shocked the conscience, it was the confirmation, in the heart of England's legal system, that such an act could be defended. The courtroom had spoken, but in doing so, it had exposed the cold machinery of the trade more clearly than ever before. And so the case did not end. Appeals followed, questions pressed forward, and new voices demanded to be heard. Lawyers and activists challenged not only the facts of the voyage but the very principle on which the ruling had been made. Was it truly possible, they asked, to treat human lives as objects of commerce? Could the sea swallow over 100 souls, and the law respond only with calculations of insurance and loss? In the appellate courts, the language began to shift. Where the initial judgment had spoken with certainty, later hearings hesitated. Doubt crept into the arguments. The morality of the matter, long brushed aside as irrelevant, began to weigh on the minds of judges and observers alike. Some insisted the law must be blind to such considerations, bound only to contracts and precedent. But others could not ignore the growing chorus that asked whether a system that placed lives on the same scale as merchandise could ever truly be just. The questions grew sharper with each session. If this decision stood unchallenged, what did it say about the values of the empire? What did it reveal about the balance between wealth and humanity, between commerce and conscience? The appeals dragged the case beyond its original frame of insurance law, forcing a reckoning with issues far larger than a single ship or voyage. In these debates, a crack began to form in the edifice of indifference. For decades, the trade had been defended as necessary, profitable, even natural. But the Zong case forced people to look directly at the consequences of that defense. No longer could the violence of the system be hidden beneath ledgers and contracts. It had spilled into the open, onto the floor of the courtroom, where judges were now compelled to confront it. The appeals did not deliver the sweeping justice abolitionists longed for. The courts never fully recognized the killings for what they were, a crime against humanity. But the very act of questioning, the very unease that entered the legal record, marked a turning point. It signaled that the iron wall of acceptance surrounding the trade was beginning to crack. The old certainties no longer felt unshakable. For Olaudah Equiano, Granville Sharp, and others who carried the banner of abolition, this was a vital opening. They used the appeals to press harder, to argue that the law itself was complicit in cruelty unless it changed. They told the public that this was not merely a case about insurance, it was a mirror held up to society, reflecting the moral cost of treating human beings as property. In the years that followed, the echoes of the Zong appeals continued to reverberate. They were cited in pamphlets and speeches, invoked in campaigns that called for the end of the trade. The questions first raised in those appellate courts became questions that would haunt Parliament, the press, and the public square. The story of the Zong did not close with the final judgment of a court. Instead, it lived on, reshaped by the outrage it provoked, carried forward by those who refused to let it be forgotten. The initial ruling had sought to settle the matter as business. The appeals unsettled it as morality. And in that tension, between law and justice, between property and humanity, the seeds of abolition were nourished. The courtroom, once a place where the tragedy had been reduced to numbers on a page, became the stage for a far larger drama. It was no longer about one ship, one voyage, or one claim. It was about the soul of a nation, about whether law could remain silent when confronted with cruelty so stark. The Zong case may have begun as an insurance dispute, but in its appeals, it became something greater, a symbol of a system under scrutiny, a crack in the armor of indifference, and a reminder that even the strongest institutions must one day face the truth of what they have allowed. There are moments in history when a single event, though not the largest or the bloodiest, changes the course of public consciousness. The tragedy of the Zong became such a moment. What happened upon that ship was not only a calamity at sea, it was a revelation, a spotlight cast upon a system that had thrived in shadows for far too long. When news of the killing spread, it did more than shock, it pierced through the carefully constructed justifications that had shielded the trade from moral scrutiny. For years, defenders of the system had relied on distance and denial. They spoke of necessity, of commerce, of empire's strength built upon the backs of the unseen. Most ordinary Britons, far removed from the coasts of Africa or the plantations of the Caribbean, never witnessed the suffering with their own eyes. It was possible, even convenient, to look away. But the Zong stripped away that distance. Its story was too brutal, too undeniable, to be softened by rhetoric. It revealed in stark detail the value system at the heart of the trade, a system where human lives could be cast into the sea and later discussed in court as though they were nothing more than misplaced goods. The impact was immediate among those who had already been working tirelessly to end the trade. Abolitionists seized upon the case, holding it up as the clearest proof yet of the cruelty embedded in the very structure of the system. Pamphlets carried vivid descriptions, public lectures retold the events, and newspapers relayed the chilling arguments made in court. The Zong was no longer just a ship, it was a symbol, a rallying point around which outrage could coalesce. In the hands of campaigners like Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp, the tragedy became more than a tale of despair, it became a weapon against apathy. Equiano, drawing upon his own life story, spoke of the Zong not as an isolated incident but as part of a larger truth. Sharp, with his relentless pursuit of justice, framed it as a moral wound that demanded healing. Together, they transformed the massacre into a story that the public could not ignore. For ordinary men and women in Britain, hearing of the Zong was like having a veil torn away. Suddenly, the trade was not an abstract mechanism of ships and goods. It was human suffering, deliberate and undeniable, sanctioned by profit and defended in courtrooms. Ministers preached sermons condemning it, artists and writers gave it form in words and images, and citizens began to ask themselves whether the wealth of their nation could truly excuse such acts. In Parliament, whispers of reform began to gain traction. Members who had long turned away from abolitionist arguments now found themselves confronted by constituents outraged at the thought of such cruelty being tolerated under English law. The Zong case provided abolitionists with a narrative that transcended politics and reached into morality itself. It became harder, with each passing year, to dismiss their calls for change. The massacre did not end the trade overnight. That fight would take decades more, with countless speeches, petitions, and acts of resistance across the empire. Yet the Zong marked a turning point, a moment when the tide of opinion began to shift. It gave the abolitionist movement momentum, a vivid and haunting story to press into the public mind, a story that could not be explained away by claims of necessity or tradition. Even those who profited from the system could not entirely escape the shadow of the Zong. Every time the case was mentioned, it reminded the world of the lengths to which greed could drive men. It stripped away the illusion that the trade was anything but a machinery of human suffering. And as the story was retold, again in courtrooms, again in pamphlets, again in the streets, it became a moral reckoning that no ledger could balance. Over time, the Zong tragedy grew into something larger than the voyage itself. It became a symbol of the turning tide, proof that even in an age when profit reigned supreme, conscience could not be silenced forever. It fueled not only legal and political debates but also a cultural awakening, inspiring poetry, art, and speeches that carried its memory forward. The ocean had swallowed more than 100 lives, yet their voices, carried through the words of abolitionists, rose louder than the waves. They could not speak for themselves, but their story, told and retold, refused to be buried. In every retelling, the massacre reminded Britain that silence was complicity, that progress required not just recognition of cruelty but the will to end it. The Zong became more than a shipwreck of humanity, it became a mirror, forcing a society to see itself clearly. And in that reflection, many recognized, perhaps for the first time, that the future of the empire could not be built upon the destruction of so many lives. The turning point had come. The abolitionist cause, once a voice in the wilderness, had found its rallying cry. The brutal realities of the trade were no longer hidden, they were exposed for all to see. Centuries have passed since the Zong set sail, yet its story still lingers like an echo over the sea. The ship itself is gone, its wooden frame long since surrendered to time and tide, but the memory of what happened aboard it refuses to vanish. Today, the Zong is remembered not simply as a tragedy at sea, but as a symbol, an emblem of how cruelty, once cloaked in the language of commerce, could strip away the humanity of countless lives. The massacre has become a lens through which we look back at the transatlantic trade, forcing us to confront its darkest truths. It is no longer just about one voyage or one courtroom, but about the entire machinery that made such an act possible. The image of men, women, and children cast into the waves remains one of the most haunting reminders of how far greed and indifference can reach when humanity is denied. The Zong teaches us that the past is not only a record of dates and events, it is a mirror, reflecting what happens when a society allows profit to outweigh compassion. In museums, in books, in classrooms, and in art, the Zong endures. Artists have painted the ocean waves filled with ghostly figures. Writers have preserved the testimony of those who fought to expose the truth. Scholars still pore over court records, searching for the voices hidden between the lines of legal arguments. And activists today hold the Zong as a reminder that injustice, if left unchecked, will always find ways to disguise itself as necessity. But the Zong is also a story of resistance. Though those who perished never had the chance to tell their side, others took up the burden of memory. Olaudah Equiano, Granville Sharp, and countless abolitionists ensured that the world could not forget. In carrying the story forward, they transformed loss into legacy, silence into a rallying cry. Because of their work, the Zong became more than a crime, it became a turning point in the struggle for freedom. Even now, its legacy calls to us. It asks us to remember not just the cruelty, but the resilience of those who survived the system. It asks us to recognize how easily human dignity can be denied when people are reduced to numbers on a page. And most of all, it asks us to carry forward the lesson that no society can call itself just while tolerating the suffering of others. The waves of the Atlantic still roll endlessly, covering the place where so many lives were taken. To stand on its shores and imagine the silence of that night is to feel history pressing close, reminding us that what happened cannot be undone, but it must be remembered. The Zong is no longer only a shipwreck lost to time, it is a symbol carved into memory, a reminder of why voices must rise against cruelty, in every age. And so, as we close this story, let us carry it with us, not as distant history, but as a living call to empathy, justice, and humanity. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful histories that deserve to be told. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May the memory of the Zong remind us all of the strength of remembrance and the necessity of compassion. Sleep well, and good night.